So this is Justin Head. So first I heard of this story was I had the pleasure of sitting with Vincent Randall for 3 hours over at the museum one day. And most of you know Vincent Randall was an Apache elder and a longtime Clarkdale resident. And he was telling all kinds of stories, and he mentioned this story that his mother had told him when he was a little boy. She said there was these killings back in the 1900s. She didn't say the names, didn't say anything, and so Vincent was very intrigued by this story. And so one day, Steve Ayers, who used to work for the Verde Independent, had brought him a bunch of information. And so Vincent was talking about the story, and the last part he had heard was that Justin Head ended up in New Jersey. And now, well, I had done a lot of genealogical research, and I thought, well, I've got on Ancestry.com a lot. I could probably find out who this guy was. And the other question was, who was Mrs. George Russell? As you know, there was a lot of Russells in town. I couldn't figure out who that would be. So after that, Vincent had done a video on this story from the documents he got from Steve Ayers back in 2022. If you go to our museum website, you'll see it. It's about a 20-minute long video, so it might give you another little insight of what he knew at the time. So once Vincent told me that story, it was August of 2023, I started doing research, and of course the story just kept building, and trying to figure out what was Justin's life like, you know, his story, the actual killings, who the victims were. And just around October or November of 2023, I had this binder all ready for Vincent with all the information so he could tell the story. And unfortunately, that's when he had ended up in the hospital and eventually passed away. So unfortunately, he did not get to know all the information that I had found out. So I was hoping he'd tell the stories, but I'm not a Vincent Randall orator, but I'll do my best to tell the story. So Justin had gone to Carlisle Indian School, and so if anybody is familiar with Jim Thorpe, the famous athlete, he was at Carlisle. It was the first Indian boarding school off the reservation. In fact, it was the first Indian boarding school which all the other ones were kind of made after. He was there for almost 9 years. They were only supposed to be there for 5 years. It was agreed that they'll only be 5 years, but they kept them as long as they could. But he got a 6th grade education, which was considered at the time very highly educated. So when he got back to San Carlos, because he had very good English and he knew both the Yavapai and more likely Apaches, which he was half Yavapai and half Apache, he could probably speak a little bit of both languages, if not almost fluently in both. So what happened was, while he was here, he did a lot of interpretive services, and there was a lot of ire going on among the Native Americans that they were saying he was telling straight stories, but they thought he was not interpreting properly in court, and was given a bad, basically not true stories of what was happening in these cases. So there was a lot of disagreement about what stories he was telling. So this is the one story of a Henry Wilson. It was his son that Justin was the interpreter in the case of back in 1905. And he said, because I acted as the interpreter in the trial of Old Man Wilson's son, who was convicted in court here a year ago and sentenced to serve a 1-year term of Yuma prison, Indian Man Wilson and a number of other Indians of the Verde Valley had threatened my life, and ever since would not allow me to stay at any one place, any length of time, at any one place. So he had 2 camps. So since he worked for the court in Jerome and Prescott, he had a camp up here, basically in Clarkdale, but he also had a camp down at Camp Verde. So he had a couple different places he lived. And this is a picture of Henry Wilson that was taken at the Trans-Mississippi International Exposition in 1898. That's him and his wife. So on Sunday, this is November 5th, 2 days before the killings, at an Indian camp, this is where Henry Wilson, the person we just showed you, it was said or alleged that he manufactures whiskey. And there was a fight that broke out with another Indian named Monkey. Henry Wilson, his son, Tekla Wilson, which is the one that Justin Head was interpreting for that went to prison. They had gotten into a fight over something, and so the monkey cut off the middle finger of Henry Wilson. So it was quite the fracas. Another guy jumped in and tried to be the peacemaker, and the monkey slashed his face. So there was over 100 Native Americans at this camp that were drinking. 25 of them were brought to Jerome. Only 3 were kept. It was Henry Wilson, his son, and Monkey. Now we don't know if Monkey was actually Justin Head because he was well known in Jerome, obviously as an interpreter. So it's hard to believe that he would be considered Monkey, but maybe it was a nickname we gave him. I have no idea, but it seems sort of coincidental that this was 2 days before the killings took place. So the actual killings took place on Tuesday, November 6, 1906. So there's numerous newspaper articles. I've gotten court documents from Charlotte Hall, coroner's reports from Family Search. And so what we know is about 11 o'clock on Tuesday, November 6th, Justin Head was at a camp about a quarter mile from Cottonwood on this side, which is pretty much Clarkdale, which fits with the story that Vincent Randall had told. And they were drinking some, what they called tiz wine, which was a fermenting, it was kind of a beer made out of corn. It wasn't very strong, but if you drank enough of it, you could get pretty drunk. But it was said that they weren't just drinking tiz wine, they were actually drinking whiskey as well. So for whatever reason, there was an argument that broke out. And Justin, this is his story, said that Henry Wilson and others had threatened to kill him on numerous occasions. He said that after leaving the first camp where the argument broke out, he was followed by this Henry Wilson. So he shot him in self-defense before he had the chance to kill him. So Justin then fled to Camp Verde in the direction of his brother's camp, George Beauty, who was down there at Camp Verde. News of this shooting spread pretty quickly, and by that time, there was a bunch of Native Americans as well as the sheriff they created a posse and were coming after him. So it was reported that he first went to an indigenous village about 2 miles north of Camp Verde, which is near John Wood's ranch, where he shot and killed 2 others. It was Chapo and Jim Stevens. He then continued to another indigenous village about 1 mile north of Camp Verde. It's C.C. Calloway's place, where it's reported he shot his brother George Beauty in the arm, shattered his elbow, and shot and killed Mrs. George Wilson. It was also reported they shot a 17-year-old boy in the abdomen who was expected to die. I believe that was Frank Stacy, and you'll see the victim names here. So like I said, a bunch of local lawmen, several former scouts formed a posse and went out searching for him. So Herb Young had told him this story in his book, They Came to Jerome, that Head went into hiding, but the story was circulated he was going on a rampage, planning to kill as many people as he could and not be taken alive. So what happened was a lot of the Native Americans in the Clarkdale were feared for their lives, and they actually went up to Jerome to get the protection of the sheriff. But it was, strangely enough, after 3 days, they never caught him. They thought he had gone to Beaver Creek and was going to head up into the mountains, but somehow he eluded them, and then after 3 days, he just turned himself into the marshal of Jerome. So there's numerous newspaper articles. Some of them are pretty extravagant. They're just kind of all over the place. Some said that he killed 8 people. He was going to emulate the Apache Kid, which was supposedly a relative, and go on a big rampage. But you know, some of these stories, like any other stories, get kind of blown out of proportion. The one article was interesting on the side. So after the Native Americans came back from San Carlos, they weren't allowed to make this tiz wine and drink on the reservation. But once they got up here, they started doing it a lot more. And so there was a lot more murders and killings and stabbings than just Justin Head, and they blamed it on alcohol. So it was a known problem. So this is a picture of the burial in Camp Verde in 1906. So It looks like there's a cross over the head of that gentleman there, but it's an X. It's actually an X over George Hans. He was the kind of sheriff or justice of the peace down at Camp Verde. So if you notice, there's 4 coffins there. So those were the 4 victims at Camp Verde. And I think the person in the wagon with his wife, I believe that might be C.C. Calloway. I'm not for sure. Based on pictures I've seen him, he does kind of have a big mustache, but I can't say for sure. And then the other people back there are Native Americans that were assisted in the burial. So 1 week after Justin was in prison, in jail, he actually was shipped over to Prescott. That's where the court case was going to be held. He did a long interview with the Weekly Miner Journal. And so I have a few excerpts, but I want to read it to you. Justin says, I was asked to come to this term of the court here and act as interpreter before the grand jury in the cases of some Indians charged with crime. And on last Tuesday morning, I dressed in my best pants, vest, and coat, saddled my horse, and started out for Prescott. I stopped at a place a short distance from my camp where the 3 Indians were drinking tiz wine, and in conversation with them, told them I was going to Prescott and did not care to stop. They told me to stop and not be in such a hurry and have some tiz wine. I only took 3 cups of it and rode along a short distance farther and met 2 old Indians, one of them nearly blind, and got off my horse to talk to the old man about getting money to go to Washington. While I was there, the old man Wilson came along, and when he had heard what we were talking about, said that I could not go to Washington. They would kill me before I ever get out of the valley, and I would kill all the white people. So Justin says, I told him that he could not kill all the white people because there were too many back east. He then went away a short distance and returned towards where I was going to get on my horse and ride to Prescott. He then said I could not leave the valley alive, and again said he would kill me. He had threatened my life before, but he looked like he wanted to kill me this time. So I rode back to my camp and, securing my Winchester, shot and killed him as he was passing by my camp. I then mounted my horse and rode in the direction of my brother's camp at Camp Verde. Before I go to see my brother, I met 3 Indians drinking tiz wine at another camp. And as I was passing one of them, they tried to stop me, and another tried to grab a hold of me. And a third got a gun and ran around the tent to head me off if I escaped the others. I shot the Indian with the gun as he came around the corner and shot another of the 2 trying to hold me. And mounted my horse and rode in the direction where my brother camped. When I got there, a number of Indians were waiting to capture me. Some Indian from Cottonwood, having gotten there ahead of me, and told that I shot old man Wilson. So that's Justin's version of the story. So a grand jury was indicted, or convened, and on December 6, 1906, at the courthouse of Prescott, Justin Head was convicted of 5 charges of second-degree murder. George Beauty, who is Justin's brother, was taken to Prescott shortly after he was shot. He was treated for his wounds, and he did survive. It had been reported that he didn't survive his wounds, but he did. These are subpoenas for people to testify in the court case. So court records indicate there were 28 people that were brought in from Cottonwood and Camp Verde area to testify. They paid their stage up to the railroad in Jerome, and they took the train from Jerome all the way over to Prescott. They even put them up, gave them room aboard for this court case. Peter Okate, who's a former classmate of Justin's while he was at Carlisle, and a Cottonwood resident, is listed as an interpreter of the case. Almost all of those that testified in the case were Native Americans from Camp Verde and Cottonwood, and have been connected to Justin for many years. Most notably were his wife, Julia Head, his brother, George Beauty, George Russell, Yuma Charlie, Euthala Charlie, and Maggie Mitchell Hayes. And so these are the affidavits of the subpoenas. And here's a list of all the names you can see. There's a couple chiefs in there, Big Mike. The only other people that weren't Native Americans was Fred Hawkins, Jerome Marshall, and George Hans. So there's a lot of names there, and a lot of those family members, their ancestors are still here today. So on December 6, Justin Head was convicted on one count of second-degree murder, only for Mrs. George Russell. The 4 other charges were all dismissed. Justin had always maintained he shot and killed only 3 people, Old Man Wilson and the 2 others, and did not shoot his brother, Mrs. George Russell. The story never changed. He even got up and testified on his own behalf at the trial and still maintained his innocence. This is a prison record for Justin Head in Yuma. So a couple of interesting facts here is, if you notice, he says he's a Mojave Apache Indian, so you would think that means he's Yavapai. So it's not real clear whether it was more Yavapai or Apache, but he was definitely half Yavapai and half Apache. The other thing that should be noted is his nearest living relative is George Beauty in Camp Verde. We're not sure why Justin Head has a different name than his brother George Beauty. There's no evidence to show why that is, but the names had always been applied a lot of times by the Army, so it's hard to say where that is. And then on the very bottom, you notice, it says he was transferred to Florence in 1909. So what happened was Yuma Prison was such a bad prison that they had shut it down in 1909, and that's when they created the Florence prison where it is today. So he basically been transferred with all the other prisoners. And then his sentence was commuted by Governor Sloan on February 10, 1912, which was really just 6 years after he was convicted. He should have served a life term. And then he was later pardoned in 1915. So we'll get to those stories of how that happened. So the records, the territory records indicate the following. Was Mrs. George Russell, and has her Native American name as Viva Vicha, Chapo, William Calla, Frank Stacy, and Jim Stevens. If you notice, Henry Wilson is not on that list. So census records that I located showed Henry Wilson, age 63, in Camp Verde, with a son named Kelly, 26, and a daughter named Minnie. And her Native American name was Tagaw. If you think about it, that name sounds very close to Tekwa Wilson, which they said was a brother. So it could be that was the familiar name. So this is a coroner's inquest that was done in Cottonwood for William Calla. He was the first victim killed here in Cottonwood. On this, it lists his wife, Sally Williams, as the only witness. It said the location was 1/4 mile away from Cottonwood and that it occurred around 11 a.m. The coroner's inquest panel included the following: Peace Officer Hart, Robert Comer, Frank Shelley, F.L. Dickinson, and Charles D. Willard was the Justice of Peace up in what was called the Upper Verde at the time. The only money found on William Cooley's person was $1.60 that was given to his wife as he had several children. So trying to identify who William Calla or Willie Cooley or William Kahula was quite a task. But it turns out he was actually a scout. So the bottom record there is a pension application that was put in by his wife, Sally Williams, later on. And if you notice the pension, you couldn't apply for pension until 1970. So he was well past. He passed since 1906. But it lists his wife, Sally Williams, his Native American name, Akoma. And so there's an upper record that's a little bit later. And if you notice, it says his wife is in an Indian village at Clarkdale. So we know that's Sally Williams, because she shows up in census. So Mike Burns, I don't know how many people know about Mike Burns, but he's the only survivor of the Skeleton Cave Massacre in the Salt River Canyon. And he was also taken in by a cavalry officer and learned English and had gone to Carlisle for a short time. But when he came back to San Carlos, he knew Justin Head. He was familiar with him. And so in his book, he wrote the story about Justin Head. He said, Head was crazy to kill someone after he'd been on a drug for nearly 2 months. And one day got his 30-30 and went to an Indian camp and began shooting. He killed a man and wounded a woman. And when he got tired, he rode off to Camp Verde, where another group of Indians were shelling for him, and said to one, I've killed Kaho'ole, your brother at Cottonwood, and now I'm going to kill you. Justin Head, the man, shot the man in the head and rode off. But it should be noted that Mike Burns did come back to Camp Verde with a lot of the other Native Americans when they left San Carlos, but at the time of the killing, he was actually the mayor. Now, the article there talks about that he was interested in going to the court case in Prescott, so he may have attended the trial. I'm not sure, but he may have. But you can see he has a different version of Justin Head that starting to show maybe a pattern that he had an issue with drinking. So now this is the coroner's inquest for Camp Verde on November 11th. So we have Jim Stevens and Chapo. The two witnesses in that killing were a gentleman named Nelson, who I've not been able to find who he actually is, and then a gentleman called Mojave C5, who I found out his name was Awala Swata, and he was the chief of the Yukupa. Then we have Mrs. George Russell, who is named as Vida Beecher and Frank Stacy. So the witnesses in that killing were Chief Novak, Jack Kinsey, George Whatguts, I believe it's Wiki, Lisa Lobo, Cobb, Matilda Cobb, George Russell, Big Mike, number one. And then Peter Okatia was the interpreter at the coroner's inquest because not all the Native Americans spoke English. And then George Hance was the justice of peace. They actually had a doctor, Dr. C.B. Wiley was the coroner, and he obviously inspected the bodies before they were buried and helped write the coroner's report. So the question was, who was Mrs. George Russell? So luckily enough, there was only one George Russell in San Carlos and one George Russell that came back to the Camp Verde area. So scouring through all these census records starting in 1894, there was a George Russell shown living with a wife named Chahu Ba and her two sons, Kadet and Bai Bai, from a previous husband. So from 1894 to 1901, those records never changed. It was George Russell and Chahu Ba and the two sons. It doesn't appear they ever had any other children together. And if you notice, she was 40 years old at the very first census record, and he was 24. The 1910 census for Camp Verde shows George Russell now married to a Helen for the past 5 years and has two children, Louisa and her newborn son Henry. So at this point, I figured that this must be the Mrs. George Russell, Chahuba. But if you see the indictment, as we said before, for the murder of Mrs. George Russell, it's not Chahuba, it's Vida Beecher. So after searching through many census records for Vida Beecher, I came up with the Beecher, whose name appears in multiple records with the groups associated with George Russell, Justin Head, and many other witnesses. So this group of people were very much interrelated, and they stayed close in Camp Verde, in Cottonwood, and at San Carlos. So they were only within a few pages of each other on the San Carlos records. So from 1892 through 1901, Vida Beecher had her son Deva, but she had three different husbands. She was first married to Mojave Dick, stepfather to Deva from 1892 to his death in 1895. Then she was the second wife to Minma from 1896 to 1899. And then she became the number two wife of a gentleman named Slick in 1901. So it's believed that sometime between 1901 and 1906, Vida Beecher became the wife of George Russell. Whether she was the primary wife or secondary wife, we have no idea. But without this book by Frida Swalia, Survival of the Avatar, and Frida's here in the audience today. I want to thank her. So this is Frida's book, and without this, we would never have identified who Mrs. George Russell was. So Maggie Mitchell Hayes was Frida's grandaunt, and she was the daughter of Childhood Bob. And so she had relayed the family history from the exodus from the original Rio Verde Reservation in San Carlos, and told the story in about 1950, and Frida heard it from her granddad and put it in her book. It's just a great history to have for a family. It's very rare, even for anybody. But anyway, in the book, she says, when they returned, when Maggie Mitchell Hayes, who had been in boarding school in Grand Junction, Colorado, she ended up at the Phoenix Indian School down in Phoenix off of Indian School Road. And she was there, and then her mother and her stepfather came and picked her up with her two brothers, and they went to Camp Verde. So we know that she was still with George Russell in 1903. But then in 1904, Judge Kahuba, which later changed her name to Mary Mitchell, then separated from her husband and moved to Camp Verde, to Bridgeport, basically, and worked at Don Ruler Train. So we know she's not with George Russell. So there's no mention of George Russell in Frida's book, but it seems pretty clear that was her husband and stepfather to the two boys. So the other victims in the case, Chapo, Frank Stacy, and Jim Stevens, they were all close to George Russell. In fact, Chapo was next to George Russell in every census record, basically within one or two families. Chapo was a scout, George Beauty was a scout, William Kahula, one of the victims, was a scout. I'm not sure about Frank Stacy or Jim Stevens, I don't believe either one of those were scouts. But it was a pretty close-knit community. So Justin Head was paroled on February 9, 1912. So with the help of Moses M. Friedman, who was the superintendent of the Carlisle Indian School, and Charles H. Rutherford, who was the city attorney in Jerome, I believe Justin had worked with a lot of these court cases. He got his parole from Governor Sloan. But the conditions of his parole were that he leave the state of Arizona and never return. And so they made an agreement for him to go back to the Carlisle Indian School. So the question is, how could this be that this man that had killed 5 people was paroled? Well, to try to understand the history of Justin, we have to go back as far as we can and see what happened to him. So in 1884, 52 Native Americans from the San Carlos Reservation, both the Yavapai and Apache, were sent to Carlisle Indian School. So the picture on the left is then when they first arrived, and then the picture on the right is after a couple of weeks. And so I believe this is Justin Head, right? This is a school record from Carlisle. You can see Justin Head in St. Carlos. And if you look over on the left there, it says Tonto Mojave. So this is where we see the half Apache, half Yavapai. This is Chief, Pocula. It's also, I've seen it spelled as Paquala, but from what I understand, he was a chief of the Yavapai, or the mix of Yavapai and Apache along the Verde River. The bottom part is interesting because this lists all the different farms that Justin had worked on during the summer. So when they were in the school during the winter time, they basically outsourced them to these farms. And these farms were in the Quaker area of Pennsylvania, just outside of Philadelphia. So this lists the name of the family that took him in, how long he was there. It says he was a carpenter, but I think he did more farming than anything, which is what they did with most of the young men who were there. Now here's a picture from Carlisle. In the upper left is Peter Opatia, who was the interpreter, and he ended up joining the Army in 1891 and then worked at San Carlos and returned to Cottonwood. Of course, Justin Head's in the lower right. He was just discharged in 1892 due to ill health. So as the reservation system was breaking down in the late 1890s, the survivors of the removal of San Carlos began drifting back to the Verde Valley, camping wherever they could. West Clear Creek, Beaver Creek, Cottonwood, Clarkdale area. So Justin Head, along with many others, settled in Camp Verde and Cottonwood. He mentions having a camp in both of those places. So this is Justin Head's return to San Carlos in 1892. He actually was living with his uncle, Kata, and then the uncle's wife, Alana still, and then of course Justin's nephew, and this Yuaju, we're not sure if that's his sister or just another niece of the family, it's not really sure. And like I said, the records show he was grouped among a lot of other Yavapai. So it's not clear why he migrated toward the Yavapai when he came out, if he was half Apache, it's just not clear. But anyway, in regards, he ended up marrying another lady called Mina in 1893, and then she was later went by the name Julia. So this is in 1894. The Indian Helper was a newspaper that was published in Carlisle. So the Native Americans that were at the school actually wrote these articles and told what was going on, what were they doing, the stories of the people that had been there before. It was kind of an informative letter that went out to other Native Americans that had left. But this story is interesting because Miss Hunt, who was recently appointed superintendent at the San Carlos School, writes in relation to our return Apache students. So they're talking about every day they came back. So it goes on, the Carlisle boys have all been to see me, and they all seem glad to see me and hear from Carlisle. And then she says, Justin Head is not well, but looks clean and sober. So in 1911, what happened while Justin was in prison, at some point the Carlisle Indian School started sending out these surveys to everybody, basically to see how they were doing, how was their life after they'd been to the school, were they doing well. And so Justin got this letter while he was in prison, and he completed it, and then he added to that a long, lengthy letter, handwritten letter. And this is to Moses M. Freeman, the superintendent of the school. He goes, I'm always trying to do right for Mojave Apaches. I keep all I can for them, but they're turned sideways on me. And said that I'm just made up talk for myself. Said that to me all the time when I ever interpret for them. When they get into trouble, they always get after me. They try to put me into trouble the way trouble comes. Those Apache Mojave Indians, they get after me and try to kill me. Now, granted, this is just Justin's side of the story. So what was really great about this story was Carlisle Indian School, through the Dickinson College, had digitized all the records of every student that had been there. And so, luckily, we have 148 letters and documents of Justin's time there. All the records you're going to see is about communications of getting paroled, what happened when he was on parole in Carlisle from 1911 to 1960. Just a treasure trove of information. So Justin got the parole, he was sent to St. Carlos in 1912. But by the time he got there, he was close to 35, 36 years old. So he wasn't a student anymore, so they just sent him back out to the same farms he worked at when he was there before. Not making much money, about $18, $20 a month. Of course, he got room and board, but really he was there just for labor. And so the way it worked, they would contract out to these people on these farms. The money would go back to Carlisle and then supposedly in the bank account in their name. And they would have to request money from the school if they needed it. So all during this time, Justin immediately was writing records automatically to get his pardon. He wanted that pardon more than anything. So here's who's writing Moses M. Freeman, the superintendent of Carlisle, asking for a pardon. And Moses M. Freeman reached out to the parole clerk, and they were basically saying, look, if you stay on the straight and narrow, you have to fill out a parole report every once in a while. You could probably get your pardon. But something happened in 1914. Things were going well because Moses M. Freeman, the superintendent of the Carlisle School, was relieved of his position after an investigation by the government. So there are 5 charges listed against him, most notably abusing the Allen system, forcing pupils on the Allens at a nominal wage against their best interests, charges of physical abuse, and incarceration of the guardians for minor infractions. So he was relieved of his duty, and now a new guy took over named Oscar Lips. So after Moses Freeman had left and Oscar Lips had taken over, Justin no longer had that connection to the people that knew him in his unique situation at Carlisle. So with the onset of World War I and
economic downturn, it was becoming more and more difficult to get farmers to have these contracts and pay for these students. So they weren't getting some of these better Quaker family farms that treated them as well as they had. So this is a request for pardon to O.H. Lips. So after communications with O.H. Lips failed to prove his position, Justin Head said, well, I've had enough of this. I'm getting off this. And he went to New Jersey, trained in New Jersey, and he actually got upon his best suit and his pocket watch just to get money for a boarding house. So he attempted to find work, but he wasn't able to. You know, unemployment was high. And obviously, he would not be picked over some of the other workers. So he wrote the O.H. Lips guy and said, look, I need some money out of my account to get my suit and my watch out because I can't go get a job looking like I am. I need money for food. He said he was starving. So O.H. Lips sends an outing agent. They had these agents that monitored them while they were out in the field. So he went out there, checked on Justin, and sure enough said, well, he's not doing well. And he's left the system, and it's not going to come back to farm. So O.H. Lips writes to the Charles Rutherford in Jerome, the lawyer that he knew, and said, look, Justin was married on the 6th of this month to a colored girl. He claims that the school has no authority over him, and they have no right to hold his money. As he is overage, there is no law to compel him. Follow those school regulations. You cannot be responsible. I understand from one who knows him at his home and knows his people out there that if should he return, his enemies in all probability would be killed. I would appreciate it if you communicated to the governor of your state, give him the information I've given you here. So Charles Rutherford said he'd write the governor and tell him about the situation. So here's a record of Justin marrying Daisy Voorhees in 1914 in New Jersey. So in January of 1915, Justin had somehow got a hold of this man named C.H. Hall, who was in the Department of the Interior, who was responsible for Indian affairs. He actually went to his house in New Jersey. He explained the situation about what was wrong with Carlisle. Then he was going to get his money out of his account, having to pawn his clothes, and then he was starving. And in response, C.H. Hall writes a scathing letter to the Carlisle. It says, Dear Sir, Justin Head has called at my house and shown me a letter dated the 2nd from you relative to his getting some money that he claims is on deposit to his credit at Carlisle for Indians. I am informed by Mr. Head that he was left beyond control of your department, that he is a citizen and owns a homestead in Arizona, that he wants and that he wants to be drawn. He claims that there is some balance of more than $50 and some cents standing on his credit, that the school that he is written for and received no attention, and that being out of work has been compelled to pawn clothing to keep from starving. I have given him several meals as a matter of humanity, and now feel that he should have his money from the school, not only as a right, but also as a necessity. I'm not passing upon any of the facts involved except here in statement, and as he is of full age and claims full citizenship, it seems no more than strange that he should be obligated to beg while the government or your department are holding up his money. It does not require the exalted learning of our administration of Washington to know that millions of men are out of work, unemployed, and falling into bread lines to keep them starving. Now, if the facts are as he has recited, it seems to me that delay in getting relief to him, as what he claims belongs to him, come mighty near being shabby outrage. I shall wait for your reply in a reasonable time. And in default, I shall present the matter to the senator from Arizona and some other senators who have a relationship. My sentiments in this matter are of a general character and not intended as personal, and I trust you will accept them as such. You can use as a reference Mr. John B. Dahlgren, attorney at law, Randallville, D.C., Senator Shively, Senator Boyle, Senator Martin. Yours truly, C. So in return, Auschwitz wasn't done yet. He decided to write the Arizona parole clerk, J.D. Sanders. Dear sir, I've read your letter regarding conduct of Justin Head. I thank you for the information. While Head was paroled to go to Carlisle Inlet School, I cannot see that it was required to remain until his discharge as a prisoner. He must avoid saloons and evil associates and live within the law. And as long as he does that, he's doing all right. Marriage has been the means of bringing many a man in a complete understanding of himself. If Justin has secured a sensible woman, she will guide him through the straits of life. Yours truly, J.J. This is C.H. Hall back to Wade Schleps again. Your letter of the 10th, relative to Justin Head, is duly received. I have seen Head and since receipt of your letter and heard the story and have written Arizona for confirmation. As if you state this man Head is on your protection of the Carlisle Union School, I cannot understand why you're not extending protection of the school for him. One does not have to draw upon the imagination to realize that thousands of men are out of employment, and in large cities, bread lines have been established to save men from starvation. This man Head is without employment, and I know he has been seeking work for many days, and that his chance of finding work is much less than those who are. I can see nothing ahead of him in this section of the country. He claims that 2 farmers in Pennsylvania near here are owing him wages, and then he cannot get money from them. If he is under your protection of the Indian School, now is the time to apply that protection and call him within those limits where such protection can be exercised. It appears a mighty similar case that a man convicted of capital crime and sentenced to life imprisonment should be paroled 5 years after sentence, and the federal government take the convict under its protection and then turn him adrift. And when he is starved, prolong the pleasure of unnecessary doses of red tape. Perhaps R.H. Pratt, who was the first supervisor of Carlisle, Mr. Freeman, might enlighten the school upon the case. Delays are not desirable. The thing to do is for the school to call in its rule and discharge its obligation to protect them. And just a little bit more on there. It is noted that Carlisle School is selling all official relations with the head, and that it's your wish that some plan be worked out whereby the said head be removed from New Jersey. You're advised that while the office appreciates the fact that some steps should be taken along into the improvement of its deportment, it does not believe it being proper to reconsider its removal to an Indian reservation. In view of the fact that his own people are hostile to him and had filed a petition in response to an inquiry from the office as to their attitude that he not be permitted to return to his home. So obviously there was a request to be got pardoned if you go back to Arizona, and they were saying nobody in the Verde Valley wanted to see him back here at all. It says, if he is considered dangerous and undesirable at home, there will be no guarantee that he will not be the same on the reservation. So, as we say, Justin was finally paroled on 27th of May, 1950 by Governor Hunt, with the help of Charles Rutherford and C.H. Hall. There's no official document located, but obviously other than his prison record that says he was pardoned. I have not been able to find it. But although Justin was finally pardoned and free from government control, it doesn't seem as troublesome. So Justin Head, in 1960, going by the name of Justin Realhead, was arrested with 3 other minors for drunkenness. The 3 minors are Carlisle Union School students who were working on farms in New Jersey prior to Allen system. Walter Starr, Paul Wan, and Luke Conway. So both federal and local authorities are investigating law violations on the sale of to Native Americans, which was actually legal at the time for any Native Americans to have alcohol. The article states that Justin Realhead, who recently got appointment with the District Department here, engaged in a fight with his father-in-law, William Voorhees, Calhoun Street, Negro, Saturday night, It is asserted that whiskey caused the rub. Both were fined $10 by Judge Gary. So Evie Merritt, who's now over the Department of Interior, writes to Mr. Lips, because Lips had sent a letter to the department about this case, trying to get something done with Justin again. He wasn't done with Justin. He wanted to see something. So the Department of Interior writes back and says, it's noted that Carlisle has severed all official relations. We revised the office of predictions and practices. I think I've already done this. But since he's considered dangerous, they're not going to let him go back to the person. So the last information we have of the location of Justin is in 1920. He was living with his wife Daisy Voorhees, her parents, 2 brothers, at 51 Wilson Street in Trenton. His occupation was as a labor flyer. So, and through Ancestry.com, where I got a lot of the information, I was able to contact the great-granddaughter of Daisy Voorhees. She had just learned of Justin being married to the great-grandmother, and so it was kind of a shock to her as well, and she did not know much information. She was not able to locate any other records as well of his death, so she assumed that he probably had died of poverty or was buried somewhere. And her grandmother had been remarried to another man, which they weren't able to find a marriage certificate of that marriage as well. So that's all we have on Justin. Unfortunately, that was the goal, was to find out what happened to Justin Head in the end, and did not find.